Okay, the second part of Ted Hughes's Bayonet Charge, and we're just going to look at the second stanza here. And more than any other session that I've done on any of the poems, we're going to focus almost entirely on one particular quote. And it is today's key quote. The full quote is there. If you can only remember a bit, remember the cold clockwork bit, but this is the full quote. And there's so much we can get out of that one quote that if you can remember the whole rhetorical question, you could write an enormously long paragraph looking at loads of different aspects and layers of interpretations just on that one particular rhetorical question. But let's read through the second stanza. Remember that in the first stanza we've been plunged into the middle of a charge. We've got a soldier who's dehumanized, gradually turning from a feeling, emotional individual into the machinery of war, and the bayonet itself is the symbol of the soldier becoming like a machine. He becomes the weapon himself. He becomes that machinery of killing within the war context. We had all of that pace. The second stanza stands out within this poem because the pace slows right down. In the first stanza we had lots of enjambment, that sense of chaos. That pauses, and the pause in the pace and the slowing down reflects the soldier just for a minute, thinking and realising and wondering what has brought him to be in this particular place at this particular time. So here's how it goes. In bewilderment then, he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and nations was he the hand pointing that second? He was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. And we're going to finish at that caesura on the final line of that middle stanza. And we'll come on to that caesura a little bit later on. But let's look first of all at that first line. In bewilderment then, he almost stopped. Bewilderment is confusion. For a moment, he becomes human again. Having been part of that machine, he suddenly, instead of acting instinctively, starts to think. And when he starts to think, he's confused. And imagine yourself suddenly clicking into a moment where you're mid-charge running towards gunfire, that most unnatural of actions, to run towards trouble rather than away from it. And he starts to think about the place around him. And notice though, he almost stopped. He doesn't actually stop, because although he's suddenly clicked into a moment of thought, he's still aware enough that by stopping he's making himself incredibly vulnerable to gunfire. So he almost stops, and later on his foot falls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. Now statuary is like a statue, so for a moment he almost stops running. He doesn't quite. It's just that moment of thought. And there's lots of punctuation in this stanza. We've got the dash at the end of that first line. And the reason for that dash is that we are meant to pause. We are meant to follow the soldier's thoughts. We're meant to, like him, come out of the fast pace for a minute and start to empathise with his thoughts. We've got the rhetorical question, and more on that in a minute. And this whole session really is based around this rhetorical question. And later on, as I said, we've got that caesura. Now, the reason we've got the caesura is to reflect that unnatural stop. Just before we get then the shot slashed furrows through up a yellow hair, that enjambment from stanza 2 to stanza 3. The contrast between the caesura and that enjambment is the end of the thought and casting us back into that moment of chaos where events happen one on top of each other without too much time for thought. Okay, now if you're going to commit Bayonet Charge to memory, you've got to try to get all of this rhetorical question to memory. If you can only remember a bit of it, remember cold clockwork, because there's so much in that. And I haven't even written the fact that it's an alliteration, which we'll come on to as well. But if you can remember it all, in what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing to that second? Say it over and over and again until it can go in. In what cold clockwork of the stars was he the hand pointing to that second? Let's try it without looking. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing to that second? Right, so now we've got that sort of committed. Let's unpick it a little bit. Let's look first of all at the whole thing. The whole thing is a rhetorical question. And a rhetorical question, as you'll have known right from primary school really, rhetorical questions give you that sense of thinking. They're there to provoke thought rather than an answer. And this rhetorical question is him asking himself and thinking himself, what is it that has brought me here? What are the actions? What are the consequences? What are the bits and pieces of time that has put together to end up with him doing something so unnatural, to becoming dehumanized, to becoming more like a machine than a man? How has his life, his fate led to that? And that idea of a brief pause to think and wonder about that links us to time and fate. There's lots of words from the semantic field of time there. Clockwork, stars, the hand, as in the hands of a clock, that second. So for that moment, how has he ended up being part of something that's so significant to the world? So again, picture yourself back into the world wars. You're in seismic historical events, hugely significant times for the whole world, and he is a small part of that. And then if you think about the cold clockwork, if you think about how clockwork is all sorts of different cogs and levers and small parts of a large mechanism. So again, it links to the idea of him being dehumanized, being part of machinery, because he is the cold clockwork, or a little cog within that enormous historical event that's actually happening. So that metaphorical use of the cold clockwork, he's part of that machinery. We might then also think about whether that's trivial. Clockwork almost makes us think like some sort of automaton, some sort of toy, a clockwork wind-up toy. And he's kind of wondering that he's being played with somewhere else. He's being pitched into battle to fight other people's battles. It's nothing that he himself needs to fight for. It's more his country, the nations. And again, that juxtaposition between the nations and he. The nations, something worldly significant and widely, enormously, historically important. And yet he is one small part of that. Just a person who months before, perhaps years before, had been just a normal person going about his daily lives, and yet he's part of this enormous machinery of war now, just a small part of that cold clockwork. I said that we would talk about the alliteration, the cold clockwork, those harsh plosive k sounds. Again, really important within the scene of battle that we have these plosive sounds, because they are explosive. They do sound dangerous. The k sounds, cold clockwork. But also think about cold as unfeeling, as cruel, as emotionless. And then you start to get the feeling that he's turned from something emotional, a normal human being, to this dehumanized, emotionless machine, this killing weapon as part of the machinery of war. So cold, that imagery of cold, is really important as well. So an enormously significant phrase within this poem, where he thinks for a moment, and what he's thinking to himself is, how has he ended up here? How is he a tiny part of the machinery of war? And then notice that the rhetorical question doesn't finish a line. So we've got another effective caesura there. He was running, and again we're pitched straight back into the charge. So the rhetorical question marks a momentary pause, not a long one, doesn't even finish two lines. That caesura is important. We are pitched unexpectedly straight back into battle. He was running, and again you've got those participles that give a continuous sense to the action, like a man who has jumped up in the dark. So again, this sense that he's just awoken from the dark and has to pitch himself straight into action, and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running. So he's running, and in between one step to the next, this is the thought that goes through his head. As he's running, he's got no time to really think. So that wondering is less than a second. It's in between footfalls. But it seems significant for him. It seems more than a brief nanosecond of thought, because his foot hung like statue in mid-stride. So he's like a statue. He feels he's slowing down time But of course, time doesn't slow down because we've got the caesura and we're pitched straight back into battle. So the second stanza, hugely important, because we've got this rhetorical question of thought in amongst the pace that just breaks it up slightly for that moment of consideration, that realization that he is becoming dehumanized, that something has pitched him into this middle of a hellish circumstance.